Russian mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin has released a video saying he never intended to overthrow the Russian government.
Prigozhin claims that he initiated Saturday's so-called March of Justice to Moscow to protest over the ineffectual conduct of the war in Ukraine.
Now, this report from SABC News correspondent Dasha Chernyshova from Moscow.
We have finally heard from Yevgeny Prigozhin. He has released an 11-minute audio to his Telegram channel of his press service. Now, he was stating some of the goals of what he calls the march of justice towards the Russian capital, and also the goals of why he had decided to turn around his convoy. Now, the head of the Wagner mercenary group has been saying that there was no goal of overthrowing the Russian authorities. He says that was a demonstration of protest because his fighters and he himself did not want to sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense. So he said by the 1st of July, his group was supposed to cease to exist. So that's why he said he has endeavored to start this march of justice. And also he has said that he didn't want to spill the Russian blood. And of course, he wanted to make sure that everybody knows about his protest. So that's why he turned his convoy around. He also has said that this march of justice was a demonstration of what the march towards Ukrainian capital, Kiev, was supposed to look like on the 24th of February 2022. He said this is what should have happened when the Russian troops have made their march towards Kiev last year. So Yevgeny Prigozhin has once again confirmed that indeed his fighters and he did not want to get associated with the Russian Ministry of Defense, but at the same time, he did not reveal anything with regards to his whereabouts. So we still don't know where Yevgeny Prigozhin is at the moment. But the deal that has been brokered by the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko suggests that Yevgeny Prigozhin should go to Belarus. Prigozhin himself says this intervention by Lukashenko allowed him to have the legal status of his Wagner fighters. So we understand that we'll be now getting to the Belarusian territory. But of course, this has yet to be confirmed when it comes to the location of Yevgeny Prigozhin. In the meantime, the Russian president has condemned the activities of the Wagner heads, saying that was treason, saying that was a stab in the back, and that was not the right time to get disunited within the Russian government, because he said the Western countries were waging a hybrid war against Russia. But of course, we are yet to hear from the Russian president, who has not been addressing the public on the matter of this failed mutiny by Yevgeny Prigozhin since Saturday morning, when he said that was a mutiny described as treason.
At the same time, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he has been following with concern the developments in Russia after the short-lived mutiny by Wagner Group on Saturday. The group briefly took over Russian military headquarters in Rostov-on-Don before a retreat was brokered by the Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. At the same time, Russia's Prime Minister says the country had faced a challenge to its stability and must remain united behind President Vladimir Putin. With a deal that diffused the crisis and averted possible bloodshed, the Kremlin says the Wagner Group mercenaries would return to base while their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin would move to Belarus. All criminal charges against him and his fighters would be dropped. The White House is discussing the situation with allies, including France, the UK, Germany and Canada. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has described the weekend's events as extraordinary, pointing to cracks emerging in Russia's facade. Let's stay with this particular story now and speak to SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena, who joins us in studio now. Sophie, of course, at the back of what is happening in the United States, we'll get there in just a moment, but do we really know if Prigozhin is in Belarus? Because seemingly a lot of people are still wondering where he is.
Clearly, he hasn't arrived in Belarus. The officials in Belarus indicated that he is not there. I think they are still discussing a way forward. Some reports are saying the government has decided to drop charges against him, but others are saying President Putin is adamant that he must account. And therefore, the situation is quite fluid, and I don't think he has left, even though he has released this audio where he's making a commitment that there's no intention to overthrow the government of President Vladimir Putin, and also there was no intention to kill the members of the military of Russia when they were marching to Moscow weekend. But clearly he is in trouble. There's no way President Putin is going to take a more reconciliatory stand, because this has really embarrassed him.
Especially because, you know, some are saying that he may still, despite what is in the public domain, he may still decide to take action against him.
Yes, indeed. I mean, many people, those who know President Putin very well, are saying there's no way he is going to allow the situation just to die. At the moment where you find Russia fighting with the so-called enemies, and you know that this has kind of opened a platform for others to look at the challenges that Russia has in terms of military, but also just the cohesion in the country.
And looking at the fact that, of course, the US and NATO allies have been discussing this matter, it's no surprise that we are now seeing a more beefed up support again for Ukraine?
Yes, indeed. But I think another issue that came out today, you had ministers of foreign affairs and defense from the European Union meeting, but also NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Let's take a listen at what the chief of NATO had to say earlier on after that meeting.
Yeah.
This is about internal Russian matters. And therefore what NATO is focused on is to support Ukraine. It demonstrates the fragility of the Russian regime, but it's not for NATO to intervene in those issues. That's a Russian matter. What matters for NATO is to not be intimidated, not be prevented from continue to provide unprecedented support for Ukraine, and also, of course, to have the necessary deterrence and defense. We have that already. We have increased our presence over the years, and with the German announcement, we have yet another example of how allies are increasing their presence. But again, it's not all about presence, it's also about the ability to have early warnings, indications, and then react quickly if there is a need, and this exercise demonstrates exactly that.
Yes, they embarked on an exercise in Finland. We have our correspondent in Finland. As we speak, we'll continue getting information from Finland.
And it's interesting that we get that particular take, but there's another take that we're also hearing from, and that's former President Thabo Mbeki and his views on this particular matter.
Well, clearly, former President Thabo Mbeki is quite familiar with the politics of Russia. I mean, during exile years, he did stay in the then Soviet Union. He's familiar with politics in both Ukraine and also in Moscow. And therefore, earlier on, my colleague Kaya Kumalo did speak to him about the latest development. What I sense from the former president is that, knowing the politics of the then Soviet Union and now Russia, because he does speak to particularly some officials in Russia, he was very, you pour cold water on this whole thing. Let's take a listen at what he said. And when I heard that the leader of Wagner has issued an audio, very apologetic, then I said, Mbeki knew something that we didn't know. Let's take a listen.
I didn't take it seriously because my sense was that this was a hopeless venture on the part of whoever was responsible in the Wagner Group, that whatever they were trying to do was not going to succeed, because it was not going to be supported by the Russian army as a whole or the population. It won't get any support in the country. And there's no way that the Wagner Group on its own could have produced any meaningful change in Russia. It couldn't. So I really, from the beginning, I said they were playing some silly game, which was not going to take them anywhere.
Some silly game,
he says. And it's quite interesting because this is a story that a lot of people have called the turning point. A lot of people have said that it's made, President Vladimir Putin uncertain somewhat. There should be more support around him. But others are saying it simply shouldn't be taken seriously. But listening to the former president calling it a silly game. One asks the question, though, Sophie, because we're in conversation with an expert earlier on here on the show, and asking how does this then impact the upcoming BRICS summit at all, juxtaposing it with some of the reports that we've seen over the weekend?
Well, clearly, if you are the advisor to President Putin, you'll advise him to stay put. Because if there was such a movement in your country that threatens the stability of your country, much as President Mbeki is saying that it was a silly game by the leader of Wagner, and now he's apologetic, we don't even know where he is. But you would want to be in your country to ensure that you don't make any mistake, particularly at the time where your enemies are likely to take an advantage or try something while you are found wanting. And two, there's a strong push in terms of Ukraine to intensify the fight, and they have to respond. And remember, Wagner was at the forefront, at the front line, and therefore you are a bit shaky. You still have to pull together the resources in that front, and therefore I'm sure many people will advise him not to leave the country and stay put, but we don't know. President Putin is President Putin.
Has a mind of his own. And
yes,
as
exactly.
A lot of people have said, you can't really tell which way things would likely go.
Yeah, look, he's so quiet right now. We don't know what's happening. We don't know where he is. The word is that he's still in Moscow. Others are saying he's in St. Petersburg. So you can't predict.
We rely on you
Putin.
then to bring us all the latest, as of course you've been covering the story front and center, giving us a sense of what's going on. Thank you so much, Sophie, for that update. That's our international news editor, Sophie Mokoena.